In a world where every moment can become viral in seconds, where privacy seems like an ancient concept, and, where a single gesture can change everything you thought you knew about someone, one woman's unguarded moment would shatter the carefully constructed image the world had of her. This isn't just another celebrity scandal or royal mishap. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what happens when the cameras we don't see are always watching, when the person you think you know in public turns out to be someone completely different behind closed doors. Camilla Parker Bowles thought she was alone. She thought the cameras had stopped rolling. She thought no one would ever see what she was about to do. She was wrong on all three counts. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about grace under pressure, about the price of being in the public eye, and about how one moment of authentic human emotion can reveal more truth than years of carefully scripted appearances. The door slam heard round the world was just the beginning. What happened next would test the very foundations of royal protocol, challenge everything the public believed about dignity and decorum, and prove that sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that were never meant to be seen. Are you ready to witness what really happens when the mask finally falls away? The morning sun painted the countryside estate in golden hues as Camilla Parker Bowles stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her cream-colored blazer for the third time. Today was supposed to be perfect. Today was supposed to showcase the unity and strength of the royal family during what the press had dubbed a challenging period for the monarchy. Today was supposed to be the day that would silence the critics once and for all. The charity event at Highgrove House had been planned for months. Every detail had been meticulously orchestrated by a team of royal advisors, public relations specialists, and protocol experts. The guest list read like a who's who of British society, mixed with carefully selected members of the press who had proven themselves to be sympathetic to the royal cause. The agenda was packed with photo opportunities that would show Camilla in her element, graciously hosting, genuinely caring, and naturally fitting into the role that had once seemed so controversial. As her lady-in-waiting made final adjustments to her appearance, Camilla's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with Charles the night before. He had been pacing the study, his hands clasped behind his back in that way that meant he was deeply troubled about something. "The papers are being particularly vicious this week," he had said, not turning to face her. "They're bringing up old wounds, old stories. There are whispers about your place in all of this, about whether you truly belong." Camilla had felt the familiar knot form in her stomach. After all these years, after all the charity work, the public appearances, the careful cultivation of her image, there were still those who questioned her legitimacy. There were still those who saw her as the woman who had caused pain to a beloved princess, regardless of the complicated truth that lay beneath those simplistic narratives. "We've weathered worse storms," she had replied, moving to stand beside him at the window. "This too shall pass." But Charles had shaken his head. "This feels different. The scrutiny is more intense. Every move we make is being analyzed, dissected. One wrong step, one moment of weakness, and they'll pounce." Now, as she prepared to face the day, those words echoed in her mind. One moment of weakness. She had built her entire public persona around control, around measured responses, around never letting them see her sweat. She had learned the hard way that in her position, authenticity was a luxury she couldn't afford. The first part of the morning went exactly according to plan. Camilla moved through the reception with practiced ease, her smile never wavering, her conversation flowing naturally from guest to guest. She discussed the importance of literacy programs with the education minister's wife, shared a laugh with the local MP about his recent gardening mishaps, and listened with apparent fascination as an elderly philanthropist recounted her memories of working with previous generations of royals. The photographers captured every moment, their cameras clicking away as Camilla toured the organic gardens, as she participated in a tree-planting ceremony, as she sat with local schoolchildren who had prepared a special performance in her honor. Each frame showed a woman completely at ease in her role, someone who had found her place and was comfortable in her own skin. But appearances can be deceiving, and Camilla was struggling more than anyone could have guessed. The night before, she had received a particularly harsh critique in one of the tabloids, questioning not just her suitability for royal duties, but her character as a person. The article had dredged up old pain, old accusations, old wounds that she thought had finally healed. The Duchess continues to play the part, the unnamed source had been quoted as saying, but those of us who knew her before know that this gracious persona is just that, a persona. Behind closed doors, she's still the same demanding, difficult woman she always was. The words had stung because they contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Camilla was demanding, she had to be in order to navigate the complex world she now inhabited. She was difficult, how else could she have survived decades of public scrutiny and personal attacks? But the implication that her public work was somehow false, that her genuine care for the causes she supported was merely an act, that cut deeper than she had expected. During the lunch portion of the event, Camilla found herself seated next to Margaret Thornfield, a society journalist known for her sharp wit and even sharper pen. Margaret had been covering royal events for over 2 decades and had witnessed the evolution of Camilla's public image from the beginning. "You've come such a long way," Margaret said as they worked their way through the first course. "I remember when you first started taking on official duties. You seemed so uncertain, so aware that everyone was watching and judging." Camilla managed a smile. "We all learn and grow, don't we? Experience is a wonderful teacher." "Indeed," Margaret replied, her eyes studying Camilla's face carefully. "Though I imagine it must be exhausting sometimes, always having to be on, always having to consider how every word, every gesture, every expression will be interpreted." The comment hit closer to home than Camilla would have liked. "I suppose that's true for anyone in the public eye," she said diplomatically. "But, when you genuinely care about the work you're doing, when you truly believe in the causes you're supporting, it doesn't feel like an act." Margaret nodded, but Camilla could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "Of course. Though I've always wondered what it would be like to see the real you, the unguarded you. I imagine that person must be quite fascinating." The conversation continued, but Camilla found her attention drifting. The real her. The unguarded her. Those were concepts that felt almost foreign after so many years of careful public presentation. She had become so skilled at being what others needed her to be that she sometimes wondered if she remembered who she really was underneath it all. The afternoon activities were designed to show Camilla's connection to rural life and environmental causes. She toured the Sustainable Farming Initiative, spoke with local farmers about the challenges they faced, and participated in a workshop on traditional crafts. Every moment was perfectly orchestrated, every photograph carefully composed. But, as the day wore on, small cracks began to appear in her composed facade. A microphone caught her snapping slightly at an aide who had misplaced her notes for a speech. A photographer captured a moment when her smile faltered as she listened to a particularly long-winded presentation about soil conservation. These were tiny moments, barely noticeable to the casual observer, but, to those who knew what to look for, they were signs that all was not as serene as it appeared. The real pressure began during the final scheduled activity of the day, an interview with a documentary crew that was putting together a piece about the modern monarchy's connection to environmental issues. The interview was supposed to be friendly, focusing on Camilla's passion for organic farming and sustainable living. But, the interviewer, James Worthington, had other plans. He began with the expected questions about the importance of environmental stewardship and Camilla's personal commitment to organic practices. But, gradually, subtly, he began to shift the focus. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his tone remaining respectful but, his questions becoming more pointed, "there are those who suggest that your environmental advocacy is a relatively recent development, perhaps motivated more by public relations considerations than by genuine long-standing conviction. How would you respond to that?" Camilla felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she maintained her composed expression. "I think my record speaks for itself," she replied. "I've been passionate about these issues for many years, long before they became fashionable or politically advantageous." "Certainly," Worthington continued, but some critics argue that there's a pattern in your public work of adopting causes that help to rehabilitate your image rather than pursuing genuine personal passions. The suggestion being that you're more concerned with public perception than with authentic engagement. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Camilla could feel the cameras focused on her, could sense the tension in the room as everyone waited to see how she would respond. This was the moment Charles had warned her about, the test of whether she could maintain her composure under direct attack. "I find it disappointing," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "when people choose to question the sincerity of charitable work rather than celebrating the positive impact it has. Regardless of anyone's motivations, the children who learn to read through our literacy programs, the families who benefit from our housing initiatives, the communities that are strengthened by our environmental projects, they see real, tangible results." It was a good answer, a diplomatic answer, the kind of response that her media training had prepared her to give. But, something in Worthington's expression suggested he wasn't finished. "Of course, Your Royal Highness, and I certainly don't mean to diminish the value of that work. But, I wonder if we might explore the personal cost of living such a carefully curated public life. Do you ever feel constrained by the need to always present a particular image? Do you ever long for the freedom to simply be yourself, without consideration for how it might be perceived or interpreted?" The question hit like a physical blow. It was so close to her own private thoughts, so similar to the conversations she'd been having with herself in quiet moments, that for just an instant, her carefully maintained composure slipped. The cameras caught it, a flicker of something raw and real crossing her features before the practiced smile returned. "I think we all have moments when we wish we could speak more freely," she said, but her voice carried a slight edge that hadn't been there before. "But, part of being in public service means understanding that your personal desires sometimes take a back seat to the greater good." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but the damage had been done. Worthington had succeeded in creating a crack in her armor, and both of them knew it. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the crew began packing up their equipment, Camilla excused herself, saying she needed to make some private calls before the evening reception. But, as she walked away from the interview location, her composure was hanging by a thread. The day that was supposed to have been a triumph was turning into something else entirely. The careful image she had worked so hard to build felt suddenly fragile, as if one more pointed question, one more skeptical look, one more suggestion that she was somehow inauthentic might cause it to shatter completely. She needed a moment alone, a moment to collect herself, a moment to remember who she was beneath all the expectations and scrutiny. She needed to find a quiet space where she could drop the mask, just for a few minutes, and breathe. What she didn't know was that someone had forgotten to turn off one of the documentary cameras. What she didn't know was that her quest for a moment of privacy was about to become the most public moment of her life. What she didn't know was that the door she was about to slam would echo far beyond the walls of that quiet room, reverberating through social media, through news cycles, through public opinion in ways that would change everything. The perfect day was about to become perfectly imperfect, in a way that would prove to be more powerful than any carefully orchestrated public appearance could ever be. The blue drawing room at Highgrove House had always been Camilla's sanctuary. Tucked away from the main reception areas, it was a space where she could retreat when the demands of public life became overwhelming. The walls, painted in a soft cornflower blue that reminded her of summer skies, were lined with personal photographs and watercolor paintings that Charles had created over the years. It was, in many ways, the most honest room in the house, a place where protocol mattered less than comfort, where image mattered less than peace. As Camilla pushed open the heavy oak door, she felt the familiar sense of relief that came with entering this private space. Behind her, she could hear the distant sounds of the afternoon reception winding down, the gentle murmur of conversation, the clink of teacups, the orchestrated pleasantries that had become the soundtrack of her public life. But, here, in this room, she could finally drop her shoulders and let her face relax from the constant smile that had begun to feel like a mask. She moved to the window seat that overlooked the gardens, where she often sat when she needed to think. The view showed the perfectly manicured hedgerows and flower beds that would soon be opening to the public as part of the estate's charitable initiatives. Even in her private moments, the responsibilities of her position followed her. There was no true escape from the weight of expectations, no real respite from the constant awareness that everything she did reflected not just on herself, but on the institution she had married into. The interview with James Worthington replayed in her mind, each pointed question feeling like a probe designed to find her weak spots. She had handled it professionally, she knew that. Her training had kicked in, her diplomatic skills had carried her through. But, something about the experience had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Perhaps it was because his questions had been so close to her own private doubts, or perhaps it was simply that after all these years, she was tired of having her authenticity questioned. Camilla removed her blazer and draped it over the back of an antique chair, then loosened the scarf around her neck. These small acts of physical relaxation felt like rebellion after hours of being perfectly put together. She kicked off her heels and curled up in the window seat, pulling her knees to her chest in a way that would have horrified her etiquette instructors but felt wonderfully human. The truth was, she was exhausted. Not just from the day's events, but from the accumulated weight of years of careful self-presentation. Every public appearance required her to be a slightly edited version of herself, more patient than she naturally was, more diplomatic than her instincts suggested, more gracious than felt genuine when faced with criticism she considered unfair. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying so hard to be accepted, she had perhaps lost touch with the parts of herself that might have made her more genuinely likable. The real Camilla, the one who laughed too loudly at inappropriate jokes, who had strong opinions about everything from interior design to foreign policy, who could be magnificently stubborn when she believed she was right, that woman had been carefully packaged and presented in more palatable portions. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see her private secretary or perhaps one of the household staff with an update on the evening's arrangements. Instead, it was her daughter-in-law, Catherine, whose presence always brought a different energy to any room. Catherine moved with the easy confidence of someone who had found her place in the royal family without losing herself in the process, something Camilla both admired and occasionally envied. "I hope I'm not intruding," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from the window seat. "I saw you slip away and thought you might need some company. Or if you'd prefer to be alone, I can certainly leave you in peace." Camilla managed a tired smile. "Company would be lovely, actually. Today has been." She paused, searching for the right word. "Challenging." "The documentary interview?" Catherine asked with the kind of directness that Camilla appreciated. There was no need for elaborate pretense with Catherine, their relationship had evolved beyond the careful formality that marked so many royal family interactions. "Among other things," Camilla replied. "I sometimes wonder if there's any amount of good work, any length of service, any degree of dedication that will ever be enough to satisfy some people. They've decided who I am, and no evidence to the contrary seems to matter." Catherine leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when I first joined the family, I used to worry constantly about whether I was doing everything right, whether I was living up to expectations, whether the public would accept me. It was William who pointed out that I was so focused on being what I thought people wanted me to be that I was in danger of losing what made me unique in the first place." "And, how did you find your way back?" Camilla asked, genuinely curious. Catherine's integration into royal life had seemed seamless from the outside, but, clearly, there had been struggles that the public never saw. "I realize that authenticity isn't about being perfect," Catherine replied. "It's about being honest about who you are, including the parts that aren't always convenient or photogenic. The public can sense when you're being real with them, even if being real means being flawed." Camilla considered this. "But, there's such a fine line between being authentic and being inappropriate. One wrong word, one unguarded moment, and, suddenly, you're front-page news for all the wrong reasons." "Perhaps," Catherine said, "but the alternative is spending your entire life as a carefully crafted character in someone else's story. Is that really living?" The conversation was interrupted by another knock, this one more urgent. Camilla's private secretary, David Ashworth, entered with an expression that immediately put both women on alert. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Your Royal Highness," he said to Camilla, "but we have a situation developing. The documentary crew believes they may have captured some additional footage during the technical difficulties after your interview. The director is requesting a private word to discuss the content before they finalize their editing." Camilla felt her stomach drop. What sort of additional footage? David's discomfort was evident. "I'm not entirely certain, ma'am. They've indicated it may be material that wasn't intentionally recorded. They're being quite circumspect about the details, but they seem to feel it was important enough to delay their departure." The implications hung heavy in the air. In the age of digital media and viral content, even the most minor misstep could be magnified into a major crisis. Camilla's mind raced through the possibilities. Had they somehow captured her brief moment of annoyance with her aide? Had a microphone been left on during a private conversation? "Give me 10 minutes, she said finally. "Then, bring Mr. Worthington to the small library. I'll see what this is about." As David left to make arrangements, Catherine reached out and touched Camilla's hand. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. The family stands together." But, as Camilla prepared to face this unexpected challenge, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her chest. The day that had been designed to showcase her strength and stability was threatening to become something entirely different. And, she had no idea what weapons she was walking into battle with. After Catherine left, Camilla took a few minutes to compose herself. She retouched her makeup, smoothed her hair, and slipped her blazer back on. But, as she prepared to face whatever revelation awaited her, she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of putting her heels back on, she remained barefoot. It was a small act of rebellion, a tiny assertion of her right to comfort in her own home. The walk to the library felt longer than usual, her stockinged feet silent on the Persian rugs that lined the corridor. With each step, she steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. Years of experience had taught her to expect the worst while hoping for the best, to prepare for embarrassment while maintaining dignity. What she couldn't have prepared for was the mixture of sympathy and excitement she saw in James Worthington's eyes when she entered the library. He rose from his chair as she entered, his cameraman and sound technician flanking him like lieutenants preparing for battle. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carrying a careful tone that was neither apologetic nor triumphant. "Thank you for agreeing to see us on such short notice. I want to assure you that what I'm about to show you was captured entirely by accident. Our camera operator thought his equipment was powered down during the break after our interview, but it appears there was a technical malfunction that left one camera recording." Camilla maintained her composure, but her heart was racing. And what, exactly, did this malfunctioning camera capture? Worthington gestured to his colleague, who had set up a laptop on the library's antique desk. "Perhaps it would be best if you simply see for yourself. Please know that we have no intention of using this material without your express permission, regardless of what rights our release agreements might technically give us." The screen flickered to life, and Camilla found herself watching footage that seemed to have been shot from the corridor outside the blue drawing room. The camera angle was awkward, clearly unintentional, but it captured enough of the scene to tell a story. On screen, she watched herself enter the drawing room, her posture perfect, her expression composed. But then, the camera caught her as she removed her blazer, as her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, as she kicked off her shoes and curled up in the window seat like a tired child rather than a royal duchess. The footage continued, capturing her conversation with Catherine, though the audio was too distant to make out specific words. But, what came through clearly was the body language of two women having an honest, vulnerable conversation. Gone was the careful posture and measured gestures of public appearances. In their place was something much more human, more real. But, it was what happened after Catherine left that made Camilla's breath catch in her throat. The camera had captured her rising from the window seat, moving to Charles's desk, and picking up a framed photograph, one of the two of them taken during their early days together, long before their relationship was public, when they were just two people who had found something precious in each other. On the recording, Camilla held the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, and, for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked completely. The expression on her face was one of pure vulnerability, exhaustion, frustration, longing, and something that looked remarkably like grief for the simpler life she had given up. And then, in a moment of pure human emotion, she had set the photograph down with slightly more force than necessary, muttered something under her breath that sounded distinctly like a very unroyal expletive, and walked toward the door with an expression of grim determination. The final moment the camera caught was Camilla grasping the door handle, her knuckles white with the force of her grip, and, then, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the glass in the nearby windows. It was a gesture of pure frustration, completely unguarded, utterly human, and absolutely contrary to every principle of royal composure she had spent years perfecting. The screen went black, and the room fell into silence. Camilla stared at the laptop, feeling as though she had just watched footage of a stranger who happened to look exactly like her. The woman in the video was someone she recognized, the person she was when no one was watching, when the weight of expectations became too heavy to bear gracefully. As I said, Worthington spoke carefully, this was captured entirely by accident. We had no intention of recording private moments, and we have no intention of using the material inappropriately. However, I felt you should be aware of its existence before we finalize our documentary. Camilla found her voice, though it took more effort than she expected. And, what, in your professional opinion, would constitute appropriate use of this material? Worthington exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. That's entirely up to you, Your Royal Highness. We could delete it completely, pretend it never existed. Or. He paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. We could consider whether there might be value in showing the public a more complete picture of who you are. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Everything in Camilla's training told her to demand the deletion of the footage, to ensure that this moment of weakness never saw the light of day. But, something in Catherine's earlier words echoed in her mind, the public can sense when you're being real with them, even if being real means being flawed. For the first time in years, Camilla found herself at a crossroads where the safe choice and the authentic choice led in completely different directions. And she had no idea which path would ultimately serve her better, or what the consequences of either choice might be. The room remained silent as she contemplated a decision that could change everything. The silence in the library stretched on as Camilla stared at the black screen of the laptop, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. In all her years of public life, she had never been confronted with such a stark choice between the safety of concealment and the risk of revelation. The footage showed her exactly as she was, human, flawed, struggling with the impossible demands of her position. It was everything her public relations team had worked tirelessly to avoid, and, yet somehow, it felt more honest than anything she had ever shared with the public. James Worthington remained respectfully quiet, understanding that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in someone's life. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the weight of the decision hanging in the air. This was no longer about a documentary or media rights or protocol. This was about a woman deciding whether to hide behind the carefully constructed image that had protected her for years, or to risk everything by showing the world who she really was. Camilla moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where earlier that day everything had seemed so controlled, so perfect. The contrast between the manicured landscape and the chaos in her heart felt almost poetic. She thought about the conversation with Catherine, about the years of careful self-presentation, about the exhaustion that had been building inside her like a pressure cooker. "May I ask you something, Mr. Worthington?" she said finally, not turning from the window. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. In your opinion, as someone who has covered public figures for many years, do you think authenticity is compatible with royal duty?" Worthington considered the question carefully. "I think, ma'am, that the public has become increasingly sophisticated in their ability to detect authenticity. They can sense when someone is being genuine, and they respond to it. Some of the most beloved public figures are those who have allowed people to see their humanity, not just their perfection. But, there are risks, Camilla said, more to herself than to him. Once you show vulnerability, you can't take it back. Once people see your weaknesses, they become weapons that can be used against you. That's true, Worthington agreed. But, the alternative is living as a character in someone else's story for the rest of your life. And, in my experience, that becomes exhausting for everyone involved, the person performing the role and, the audience watching it. Camilla turned back to face him, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. What would you need from me if we were to use this footage? What would be required to do it properly, responsibly? The energy in the room shifted immediately. Worthington sat forward, his professional instincts engaging. We would need context. The footage by itself could be misinterpreted. It could be seen as a tantrum rather than what it actually was, a moment of very human exhaustion with the pressures of public life. And, how would you provide that context? We would need you to be willing to talk about it honestly. To explain what was happening in that moment, what you were feeling, why the pressure became too much. We would need you to be as real in the interview as you were in that unguarded moment. Camilla felt her stomach clench at the prospect. Everything in her training screamed against such exposure. Royal family members simply didn't discuss their feelings publicly, didn't admit to moments of weakness, didn't acknowledge the toll that public life took on their private selves. Could I have some time to consider this? She asked. Of course. We're prepared to wait for your decision, however long that takes. As Worthington and his team prepared to leave, Camilla made another impulsive decision. Actually, Mr. Worthington, if you could spare a few more minutes, I think I'm ready to give you that honest interview you mentioned. The surprise on his face was evident, but he quickly gestured to his colleagues to reset their equipment. Are you certain, ma'am? This is quite a significant departure from your usual media approach. Perhaps that's exactly why it's necessary, Camilla replied, settling into the chair across from where the camera would be positioned. If we're going to do this, let's do it properly. As the camera began rolling, Camilla faced a choice that would define not just this moment, but, potentially the rest of her public life. She could give the usual diplomatic responses, the carefully crafted answers that revealed nothing while offending no one. Or she could honor the woman she had seen in that footage, the real person behind the royal title. Mr. Worthington, she began, her voice steadier than she felt, you asked earlier whether I ever long for the freedom to simply be myself without consideration for how it might be perceived. The honest answer is yes, constantly. Worthington's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. Can you elaborate on that? Camilla took a deep breath, crossing a bridge from which there would be no return. When I married into this family, I knew I was accepting certain constraints on my personal expression. What I didn't fully understand was how completely those constraints would permeate every aspect of my existence. There are days when I feel like I'm living inside a carefully constructed character, playing a role that may be inspired by who I am but isn't quite the complete picture. And, how does that feel? Exhausting, she said simply. It's exhausting to constantly monitor every word, every gesture, every facial expression. It's exhausting to know that any momentary lapse in composure will be analyzed, criticized, and, potentially held against you for years to come. The questions continued, each one drawing her further from her usual diplomatic safety zone. Worthington asked about the pressure she felt to measure up to others who had held her position, about the challenge of stepping into a role that came with so much historical baggage, about the personal cost of living such a public life. And, to her own surprise, Camilla found herself answering with an honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating. She spoke about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw her role before they saw her person. She acknowledged the moments when she questioned whether she was truly making a difference or simply going through the motions of charitable work. She even admitted to the occasional fantasy about what it would be like to simply walk away from it all. You mentioned walking away, Worthington said carefully. Is that something you've seriously considered? Camilla paused, recognizing that her answer would likely be the headline of whatever coverage emerged from this interview. I think anyone in my position has moments when they wonder what life would be like without the constant scrutiny. But, the truth is, despite its challenges, this role has also given me opportunities to contribute to causes I care deeply about. The question isn't whether I've considered walking away, it's whether I can find a way to do this job authentically while still meeting the expectations that come with it. And, have you found that way? I'm working on it, she said with a small smile. Today, actually, has been something of a breakthrough in that regard. When the interview finally concluded, Camilla felt simultaneously drained and energized. She had just violated nearly every principle of royal media relations, had revealed more about her inner life than she ever had publicly, and had potentially created a public relations nightmare for herself and her family. But, she had also, for the first time in years, felt like herself during a public appearance. As the crew packed up their equipment, Worthington approached her with an expression of genuine respect. Your Royal Highness, I want you to know that what you've shared today represents a significant act of trust. We won't take that lightly. See that you don't, she replied, but her tone was more friendly than stern. And, Mr. Worthington, I hope you'll include that unguarded moment we discussed. Not as a gotcha moment, but as part of the complete picture. Sometimes the most honest thing you can show about someone is that they're human enough to get frustrated. After the crew left, Camilla remained in the library, contemplating what she had just done. She would need to call Charles, to prepare him for what was coming. She would need to brief her staff, to get ahead of the potential reactions. She would need to steel herself for criticism from those who believed royal family members should never show such vulnerability. But, for the moment, she simply sat in the quiet library, feeling lighter than she had in years. The mask had finally come off, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, something told her that it might just be beginning. The phone call to Charles was as difficult as she had anticipated. His initial reaction was one of concern bordering on panic. Darling, are you quite certain about this? He asked after she had explained the situation. Once this is public, we can't take it back. The palace will have thoughts, the press will have a field day, and there will be those who see this as vindication of every criticism they've ever leveled against you. I know, she said simply. But, Charles, I also know that I can't continue living as a carefully edited version of myself. It's not sustainable, and it's not honest. If we're truly committed to modernizing the monarchy, perhaps that means accepting that royals can be human beings rather than perfect symbols. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You realize this could backfire spectacularly. Yes, she acknowledged. But, it could also work. People might appreciate the honesty. They might respond to seeing someone in our position acknowledging that the job is difficult rather than pretending it's all garden parties and ribbon cuttings. And, if they don't? If this opens you up to even more criticism? Camilla considered the question seriously. Then, at least the criticism will be directed at who I actually am rather than at some imagined version of me. There's a certain freedom in that. Charles was quiet for a long moment. You know I'll support you regardless of what you decide. I know. And, I love you for it. But, Charles, I've already decided. The interview is done, the footage exists, and I've given permission for them to use it all. There's no going back now. As she hung up the phone, Camilla realized that her decision had already begun to transform her. The woman who had slammed the door in frustration a few hours earlier had been carrying the weight of years of suppressed authenticity. The woman who had just finished giving the most honest interview of her life felt, for the first time in years, like she could breathe freely. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, flawed, human, real. And, perhaps, she thought as she finally headed upstairs to prepare for dinner, that would be enough. The documentary wouldn't air for several weeks, but the change in Camilla was immediate. Her staff noticed it first, the way she carried herself with a different kind of confidence, the way she seemed more present during meetings, the way her smile appeared more genuine during public appearances. The woman who had spent years carefully managing her image was about to discover what it felt like to live without that burden. And the world was about to see what authenticity looked like when it wore a crown. The morning of the documentary's broadcast, Camilla woke with a knot in her stomach that reminded her of childhood Christmas mornings, a mixture of excitement and terror that came from knowing everything was about to change. The 3 weeks since filming had passed in a blur of normal royal duties, but, underneath the surface, she had been preparing herself for this moment when her most vulnerable self would be broadcast to millions of people. Charles had been unusually attentive during those weeks, checking in on her emotional state more frequently than usual. The palace communications team had developed multiple response strategies depending on how the public reacted. Her children had called to offer their support, each in their own way trying to prepare her for potential backlash. But, nothing could really prepare someone for the moment when they voluntarily exposed their soul to public judgment. The documentary was scheduled to air at 9 o'clock in the evening, prime time for maximum viewership. Camilla had decided to watch it with Charles in the small sitting room at Clarence's house, away from staff, away from advisors, just the two of them facing whatever reaction would follow. But, the real tension began hours before the broadcast, as early reviews and social media previews started appearing online. Camilla had asked her private secretary to monitor the initial responses and provide her with a general overview rather than specific details. She didn't want to spend the day analyzing every comment and criticism before the full context was available. What she learned was that the clips released as promotional material, carefully selected moments from her interview where she spoke about the challenges of royal life, had already begun generating intense discussion. The palace's social media accounts were experiencing unusually high traffic, with comments running the full spectrum from supportive to highly critical. The early reactions are passionate, David Ashworth reported during their afternoon meeting. People seem to have strong feelings either way. There's significant support from those who appreciate your honesty, but also criticism from those who feel royal family members shouldn't discuss such personal matters publicly. Anything unexpected? Camilla asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Actually, yes. There's been an interesting response from other public figures who have shared their own experiences with the pressure of living in the public eye. Several celebrities and politicians have posted supportive messages about the courage it takes to show vulnerability. It seems to have sparked a broader conversation about authenticity in public life. That evening, as the opening credits of the documentary began, Camilla felt her heart racing. The program was titled, Behind the Crown, A Duchess Speaks, and the early segments covered her charitable work and environmental advocacy in familiar territory. She watched herself moving through the expected motions of royal duty, and was struck by how different the woman on screen looked from how she felt inside. But, then, came the interview footage, and Camilla found herself watching her own transformation in real time. On screen, she could see the exact moment when she had decided to abandon the diplomatic safety of her usual responses. There was a visible shift in her posture, in her facial expression, in the cadence of her voice as she chose authenticity over artifice. When I married into this family, I knew I was accepting certain constraints on my personal expression, her televised self was saying. What I didn't fully understand was how completely those constraints would permeate every aspect of my existence. Charles reached over and took her hand as they watched her describe the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw her role before they saw her person. She had forgotten how raw some of her answers had been, how completely she had abandoned the careful language that usually characterized royal interviews. But it was when the documentary showed the footage of her unguarded moment in the blue drawing room that Camilla felt her breath catch. Even knowing it was coming, seeing herself in that state of complete vulnerability, exhausted, frustrated, human, was jarring. The contrast between her public persona and her private exhaustion was stark, almost painfully so. The footage showed her holding the photograph, her hands trembling slightly, her composure cracking completely. And then, came the moment that would become iconic, the door slam that reverberated through the audio with shocking clarity. But, What surprised Camilla was the context that surrounded that moment in the final edit. Worthington had kept his promise to present it not as a tantrum, but as the human breaking point of someone carrying an impossible load. The interview segments that followed showed her explaining what had led to that moment, what it felt like to constantly perform a version of yourself for public consumption. Sometimes, her televised self said, the most honest thing you can show about someone is that they're human enough to get frustrated. I slammed that door because I needed to release pressure that had been building for years. It wasn't my finest moment, but it was perhaps my most real moment in a very long time. As the documentary concluded, Camilla and Charles sat in silence for several minutes. The phone had been ringing constantly, but they had asked staff to hold all calls until after the broadcast. Now, they would need to face the reactions. "How do you feel?" Charles asked finally. "Terrified," she admitted. "And relieved. And proud. And sick to my stomach." She managed a weak smile. "I suppose that's what happens when you stop hiding." The initial reviews that came in over the following hours were more positive than anyone had dared hope. Television critics praised the documentary for its honest portrayal of the human cost of public life. Several major newspapers ran editorials about the courage required for such vulnerability. Social media, typically a harsh judge of royal behavior, was surprisingly supportive. But it was the personal responses that surprised Camilla the most. Her phone began receiving calls and texts from people she hadn't heard from in years, old friends who said they had finally seen the woman they remembered, colleagues who thanked her for normalizing the struggle of living up to impossible expectations, even strangers who had somehow obtained her contact information to share their own stories of pressure and burnout. The palace's official social media accounts were flooded with comments from people sharing their own moments of frustration, their own experiences with the pressure to maintain a perfect facade. The hashtag real moments began trending, with people posting about their own unguarded instances of humanity. Within 48 hours, it became clear that something unprecedented had happened. Rather than damaging Camilla's reputation, the documentary had humanized her in a way that years of carefully orchestrated public appearances never could. The door slam that she had feared would become a symbol of royal temperament had instead become a symbol of relatable human emotion. Margaret Thornfield, the society journalist who had challenged Camilla during the charity lunch, wrote a particularly insightful column about the documentary's impact. "For years, we have demanded that our public figures be both perfectly human and perfectly superhuman," she wrote. "The Duchess of Cornwall's documentary shows us what happens when someone chooses to be simply, authentically human instead. The result is not scandal, but connection." But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the broadcast, Camilla received a handwritten letter from a young woman named Sarah, a university student who had been struggling with anxiety and depression. "Your Royal Highness," the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for showing us that it's okay to have moments when the pressure becomes too much. I've been trying to be perfect for so long that I forgot it was okay to be human. Watching you admit that you get overwhelmed too made me realize that struggling doesn't make me weak, it makes me normal. I've decided to seek help for my anxiety, and I wanted you to know that your honesty gave me permission to be honest about my own struggles." The letter, and dozens of others like it, represented something that no amount of traditional royal charity work could have achieved. By showing her vulnerability, Camilla had given others permission to acknowledge their own. The long-term impact of the documentary became clear over the following months. Camilla's public appearances took on a different quality, she seemed more relaxed, more genuinely engaged, more present. The press coverage of her activities shifted from skeptical analysis to respectful documentation. Even the most critical royal watchers acknowledged that something had fundamentally changed in how the public perceived her. More importantly, her work began to reflect this new authenticity. She started speaking more personally about the causes she supported, sharing her own experiences rather than relying solely on prepared remarks. Her speeches became more conversational, her interactions with the public more natural, her entire approach to royal duty more grounded in genuine connection rather than ceremonial obligation. The palace communications team, initially terrified by her departure from protocol, found themselves dealing with a public relations goldmine. Camilla's approval ratings reached heights they hadn't seen since her early days as Charles's wife. International media began requesting interviews, wanting to understand the woman behind the transformation. But, perhaps the most telling response came from within the royal family itself. Other family members began speaking more openly about the challenges of their positions. The conversation that Camilla had started rippled through the institution, creating space for a more honest discussion about the human cost of royal duty. 6 months after the documentary aired, Camilla was asked during a public appearance whether she regretted her decision to be so open about her struggles. Not for a moment, she replied without hesitation. I spent years trying to be what I thought people wanted me to be, and it was exhausting for everyone involved. The moment I decided to be who I actually am, flawed, human, real, everything became easier. Not just for me, but for the people I'm trying to serve. The woman who had once slammed a door in frustration had opened a completely different kind of door, one that led to a new way of being royal in the modern world. And, the public, rather than being scandalized by her humanity, had embraced her for it. The authentic Camilla, it turned out, was far more compelling than any carefully crafted public persona could ever be. And, in choosing vulnerability over perfection, she had not only transformed her own life but had given countless others permission to be authentically human in their own public and private struggles. The door slam heard round the world had become the sound of barriers breaking down, walls coming down, and real connection finally being possible between a royal family member and the people she served. What started as an unguarded moment of frustration had become a masterclass in the power of authenticity to transform not just individual lives, but entire institutions. And Camilla, who had spent years afraid of showing her true self, discovered that the truth was the most powerful tool she had ever wielded. 1 year after the documentary that changed everything, Camilla stood in the same blue drawing room where her journey toward authenticity had begun. But, this time, she wasn't seeking refuge from the pressures of public life. This time, she was preparing to host the most important meeting of her career, a gathering that never would have happened if she hadn't chosen vulnerability over perfection. The room had been transformed into an intimate conference space for representatives from mental health organizations across the Commonwealth. They had come together for the first International Summit on Public Life and Mental Wellness, an initiative that had grown directly from the conversations sparked by Camilla's moment of unguarded humanity. As she reviewed her notes for the opening address, Camilla reflected on the extraordinary year that had followed her decision to show the world her true self. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without challenges, but the journey had been more rewarding than she could have imagined. The immediate aftermath of the documentary had been intense. For weeks, every public appearance was scrutinized through the lens of her newfound authenticity. Critics waited for signs that her openness had been a calculated public relations move. Supporters analyzed every gesture for evidence that she was continuing to evolve. The pressure to live up to her own honesty had been, ironically, another form of performance anxiety. But, gradually, something remarkable had emerged from that scrutiny. The public's relationship with her had fundamentally changed. Instead of the polite distance that had characterized her early years as a royal, people began approaching her with genuine warmth. They shared their own struggles, thanked her for normalizing difficult emotions, and treated her less like a distant figure and more like someone they could relate to. The transformation had extended far beyond public perception. Camilla found that her relationships within the royal family had also evolved. Family dinners became more honest conversations about the challenges each of them faced. The artificial barriers that protocol had created began to dissolve, replaced by genuine connection and mutual support. Charles, initially worried about the risks of her newfound openness, had become her strongest advocate for continuing to push boundaries around royal authenticity. "You've shown us all what's possible when we trust people with the truth," he had told her just weeks earlier. "The monarchy is stronger because you were brave enough to be human." The professional impact had been equally dramatic. Camilla's charitable work had taken on new depth and effectiveness. When she visited mental health facilities, she spoke from personal experience about the pressure to maintain a perfect facade. When she met with young people struggling with anxiety and depression, she could offer genuine empathy rather than ceremonial sympathy. Her literacy programs had evolved to include components about emotional literacy, helping people understand and express their feelings in healthy ways. The environmental initiatives she supported began incorporating discussions about the mental health benefits of nature and sustainable living. Every cause she championed became more meaningful because she brought her authentic self to the work. But, perhaps the most significant change had been the emergence of what the press had dubbed the Camilla effect, a broader movement toward authenticity in public life that extended far beyond the royal family. Politicians began speaking more openly about mental health challenges. Business leaders started acknowledging the pressure of their positions. Celebrity culture began shifting away from impossible perfection toward relatable humanity. The letter that had started it all, Sarah's thank you note about seeking help for anxiety, had led to an ongoing correspondence that illustrated the ripple effect of authentic vulnerability. Sarah had not only gotten help but had become an advocate for mental health awareness on her university campus. She had organized support groups, lobbied for better counseling services, and even started a blog about the pressure young people faced to appear perfect on social media. "Your door slam became my wake-up call," Sarah had written in her most recent letter. "It gave me permission to stop pretending everything was fine and to start dealing with what was actually happening in my life. That moment of your frustration literally saved my mental health." Similar stories had poured in from around the world. A businessman in Australia credited watching the documentary with giving him the courage to seek therapy for burnout. A teacher in Canada said Camilla's honesty had helped her address her own perfectionism issues. A mother in South Africa wrote about how the footage had sparked important conversations with her teenage daughter about the pressure to maintain a perfect image. As representatives from mental health organizations began arriving for the summit, Camilla was struck by how different this gathering was from traditional royal events. There were no rigid protocols, no careful seating arrangements based on rank and precedence. Instead, the atmosphere was one of genuine collaboration among people committed to addressing real problems. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychiatrist who had become one of Camilla's key advisors on mental health initiatives, arrived early to review the day's agenda. "I have to say, Your Royal Highness," Dr. Morrison said as they went through the schedule, "when we first discussed this summit 6 months ago, I wasn't sure we'd be able to create the kind of authentic dialogue we were hoping for. But, your willingness to share your own experience has set a tone that's allowing everyone to be more honest about these issues." "That's precisely the point," Camilla replied. "For too long, discussions about mental health in public life have been theoretical. People in positions of responsibility pretend they're immune to stress, anxiety, and burnout, which only makes everyone else feel like they're failing if they struggle. We need to normalize the conversation by having it honestly." The summit brought together representatives from 15 countries, all dealing with the mental health challenges that came with increasing public scrutiny in the digital age. Politicians, healthcare workers, educators, business leaders, and activists had all come to discuss how to create more sustainable approaches to public service and leadership. Camilla's opening address drew directly from her own experience, but expanded it into a broader framework for understanding the intersection of public responsibility and personal wellness. "A year ago," she began, "I slammed a door in frustration, thinking I was alone, thinking no one would see, thinking it was simply a private moment of weakness. What I discovered is that sometimes our most vulnerable moments are actually our most powerful tools for connection." That door slam became a bridge to authentic conversation about something we all experience but rarely discuss openly: the challenge of maintaining our humanity while serving in the public eye. She spoke about the artificial separation between public and private selves, about the mental health cost of constantly performing perfection, about the isolation that came from believing you had to handle everything alone. But, more importantly, she spoke about what had changed when she chose authenticity over image management. "I learned that vulnerability is not weakness," she continued. "It's the courage to show up as your authentic self, even when that self is struggling, imperfect, or overwhelmed. And I learned that when we model that kind of honesty, we give others permission to be honest too. The presentations that followed demonstrated the breadth of the challenges they were addressing. A member of parliament from New Zealand spoke about the suicide rates among young politicians. A CEO from a major corporation discussed the epidemic of executive burnout. An educator from Kenya talked about the pressure teachers face to be perfect role models while dealing with their own trauma and stress. But, what made the summit remarkable was how the discussions went beyond identifying problems to developing practical solutions. Working groups developed frameworks for supporting public figures' mental health, created resources for managing public scrutiny while maintaining authenticity, and designed training programs for helping leaders develop emotional intelligence alongside professional skills. Dr. James Patterson, a psychologist who specialized in working with high-profile individuals, led a session on sustainable authenticity, how to be genuine without oversharing, how to maintain appropriate boundaries while still being relatable, how to use personal experience to connect with others without making everything about yourself. What Her Royal Highness has demonstrated, Dr. Patterson said during his presentation, is that authenticity isn't about sharing everything. It's about sharing strategically and, purposefully, in ways that serve others rather than just serving your own need to be seen and understood. The afternoon sessions focused on practical implementation. How could organizations create cultures that supported authentic leadership? How could media coverage shift away from scandal-seeking toward more constructive engagement with public figures' humanity? How could educational institutions better prepare future leaders for the mental health challenges of public life? Camilla found herself energized by the conversations in ways that traditional royal engagements had never achieved. This wasn't ceremonial participation, this was substantive collaboration on issues that mattered deeply to her and to the people she served. During a break in the proceedings, she was approached by Maria Santos, a young activist from Brazil who had gained international attention for her environmental work but had also been open about her struggles with anxiety and depression. "Your Royal Highness," Maria said, "I wanted to thank you for making this possible. For the first time, I feel like I'm in a room where I can be both effective and human at the same time. The work I do is important, but it's also overwhelming sometimes, and I've felt like admitting that would undermine my credibility." "And now?" Camilla asked. "Now I realize that acknowledging the emotional weight of the work actually makes me more effective, not less. When I'm honest about the challenges, people trust me more, not less. They see that I'm doing this work because I care deeply, not because it's easy." As the summit concluded with commitments to ongoing collaboration and resource sharing, Camilla realized that the most significant outcome wasn't any specific policy or program that had been developed. It was the normalization of a conversation that had been desperately needed but rarely had. That evening, as she reflected on the day's discussions, Camilla received a call from Sarah, the young woman whose letter had meant so much to her. "I saw the coverage of your summit," Sarah said. "I wanted you to know that watching you create space for these conversations has inspired me to organize something similar on my campus. We're calling it Real Talk About Real Pressure, and we're bringing together student leaders to discuss mental health and authentic leadership." It was exactly the kind of ripple effect that Camilla had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Her moment of frustration had become a movement toward more honest, sustainable, and ultimately more effective approaches to public service and leadership. Over the following months, the initiatives that emerged from the summit began taking shape. Leadership development programs started incorporating mental health components. Public speaking training included modules on authentic communication. Organizations began implementing policies that explicitly supported their public representatives' wellness rather than expecting them to sacrifice their humanity for their effectiveness. The media landscape began shifting as well. Instead of hunting for moments of weakness to exploit, some journalists started recognizing the value of showcasing the human side of public figures in constructive ways. Interview techniques evolved to create space for genuine conversation rather than gotcha moments. But the most profound change was in how the public related to their leaders, celebrities, and other high-profile figures. The expectation of perfection began giving way to an appreciation for authenticity. People started valuing leaders who could acknowledge their struggles and learn from their mistakes over those who pretended to be infallible. 2 years after the door slam that started it all, Camilla received an unexpected honor. Time magazine named her one of their most influential people, not for any single achievement, but for demonstrating that vulnerability can be a superpower, that authenticity can strengthen institutions rather than weaken them, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a leader can do is admit they're human. The article that accompanied the honor included a quote that captured the essence of what had changed. The Duchess of Cornwall didn't just slam a door, she opened a completely new way of thinking about power, responsibility, and the courage required to be genuinely yourself in the public eye. As Camilla read the article, she thought about the woman who had entered that blue drawing room in frustration and exhaustion 2 years earlier. That woman had been trapped by the impossible expectations of perfection, isolated by the assumption that showing weakness would undermine her effectiveness, exhausted by the constant performance of an idealized version of herself. The woman reading the magazine now understood that her greatest strength had never been her ability to maintain a perfect facade. It had been her willingness to be authentically human, even when that was messy, even when that was uncomfortable, even when that required admitting that she didn't have all the answers. The door she had slammed in frustration had become the door that opened to genuine connection, meaningful work, and a completely transformed understanding of what it meant to serve others while remaining true to yourself. And, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that authenticity wasn't just about being honest about your struggles. It was about being honest about your growth, your learning, and your ongoing commitment to becoming the person you were meant to be, not just the person others expected you to be. The woman who had once hidden behind a carefully constructed image had become someone who could inspire others simply by being courageously, authentically herself. And, in a world hungry for genuine connection and real leadership, that authenticity had become the most powerful tool she possessed. The door slam heard round the world had become the sound of change, change in how we think about leadership, change in how we relate to public figures, and change in how we understand the relationship between vulnerability and strength. In choosing to be human, Camilla had reminded everyone else that they had permission to be human too. And that, perhaps, was the most royal gift she could have given to the world.